Hello, and welcome back to Extra Literary Affairs, a podcast for the lit curious reader because why not read a little of everything? I'm Joey Kelly.
And I'm Jennifer Smith.
And today we're having another affair with Langston Hughes and his short story Slice Him Down, which was originally published in Esquire magazine. So we have read him quite a few times now together on this podcast / YouTube channel. The plot of this story is that we have two friends named Terry and Sling. We don't know Sling's real name. We just know that he prefers to go by Sling, who ride the rails together. They end up in Reno, Nevada, where they sort of settle and start to get jobs. They buy new clothes and they find some girlfriends to entertain them. And it's a very quick story. It's not very long at all. My ebook version is only 22 pages long, but I mean, that's probably like at least half that, if not less. In the end, they have a falling out over these two women their names are Charlie May and Mrs. Angelina Walls. And so we also have an interesting tidbit for this episode because I had just found online randomly that somebody had posted the original manuscript for this story from Langston Hughes. So we're going to talk a little bit about that and what the difference is between the original one that Langston Hughes had intended to use for this story and what ended up going into Esquire magazine. But anyway, before we get to that, Jennifer, what did you think of this story? This was your first time reading it, right?
It was the first time I read this story by Langston Hughes. And Joey, I just wanted to go back to your summary. What I found was really interesting is this came out in 1936, right? So this was a very, very old story. There was a lot going on in the world, a lot going on in the US in 1936. Langston Hughes, as you said, initially wrote this in 1934. He sold it to Esquire magazine. They made some edits. They asked him to make some changes, which I'm sure we will talk about. And I appreciated that you brought my attention to the original manuscript that was found in Langston Hughes' papers that has a very, very different ending. And when I first read the story, I was like, this story didn't exactly go where I thought it was going to go. And then when I read the ending that he originally wrote, I'm like, yeah, that's where that went when I read it the first time. So I thought, oh, isn't that interesting? And Joey, because we are in the month of February in the United States, it is Black History Month. And what I loved so much about us choosing this piece is there's so much of U.S. history, African American literature. All the things are mentioned in this story. And I just thought that was really a great choice to kick us off. So I will say, the story was really interesting. Some of the language was difficult, not because I didn't know the words, but those are very outdated and racially insensitive terms. So I think that was just something I would like to call out for people reading the story for the first time. You might want to keep in mind when this was written and who wrote it. It was a person from that community making commentary about those he was interacting with and observing in his own community. But 1936, they were in the Depression. It was tough times. The Dust Bowl, like a lot of stuff
The
was
Wizard
happening.
of Oz comes out.
Wizard of Oz, Gone with the Wind, I think also came out like in the early 30s, right around this time. I originally asked the question, what happened in 1936, but he wrote it in 34. So a lot can change in the world in 2 years. What was so interesting for me, this was published in Esquire magazine. Joey, you and I have often spoken about, do people read short stories anymore? Where's the market for short stories? Where do people even find short stories? Well, we were finding short stories in the New Yorker in our time, but back in the 30s, 40s, 50s, publications like the Esquire magazine were great sources for short stories. So I just thought it was very interesting that he showed up in such a prominent magazine as a working writer at that time in the Depression. This was how he made his living. So he really needed to acquiesce to the requests of Esquire to make this story a bit more palatable to their audience, which at that time was straight white guys in America who could afford to pay 50 cents for the magazine. Joy, I'll just wrap one more thing up because I was like in love with the history behind the story. Back in 1936, 50 cents is equivalent to $11. I don't know if you buy magazines off the magazine rack, but I don't pay $11 for magazines. That's just not something that I do, and I'm a very avid reader. So it just was a question for me in my mind. Who was this written for, and who had access to it in the time that it was written?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point to bring up, is what the cost would have been, which, again, I mean, $11, I guess that doesn't sound necessarily like, oh my God, that's so expensive, but $11 for a single magazine is expensive. So yeah, 50 cents in 1936 is going to be like a price that only a certain group of people who with the economic backing can purchase and have access to.
And Joey, to put into context, the person that I got this information from said gas was 10 cents a gallon by comparison, and bread was 8 cents. So if you think about it in those terms, that's a significant investment for a monthly magazine.
Yeah, that is expensive now that you put it in those terms. I don't know who their readership was. Obviously, it was people privileged enough to be able to buy that and to have the disposable income to do that. That's good to know. It's always nice to get more of the historical background of what's going on at the time of when these stories are written or published, rather. So we have a better understanding of like, what does the world look like while this is being published? But anyway, we should have a History Channel too. Okay, so I really love this story. For some reason, it has stuck with me. I mean, because it's Langston Hughes, and he is an amazing writer, obviously, so most of his stuff sticks with me. But for some reason, this one in particular has stuck with me after all of the short stories that I've read from him so far. And I think I read it like last summer. So it's been quite a while, and I still have been thinking about it. It's obviously beautifully written, and I've talked about this in the past, but this hasn't come up recently. I guess we just haven't been reading authors who are also poets lately. But Langston Hughes is, of course, both an author and a poet. Those are my first picks for authors. Is if you're also a poet, your writing is just going to be different. I'm not saying it's better than somebody that only writes in prose, but for me, there is like a musicality to this. There's literally music in it. And there's like a song. But on a prose level, like there is a sort of rhythm and a musicality to his writing that I really love. And I think it just makes it even more readable. And we touched on, and we might as well just talk about that first probably, is that there was the change that Esquire magazine, the editor, requested. So for the brief background there, as we mentioned, Langston Hughes had this story published in 1936 in Esquire magazine, which I believe had started in 1933. It seems fairly new at that point, but it's still a nationwide magazine and publication. So it's still a big deal, even though it's pretty new in its inception here. So their note to Langston Hughes was, this has to be a happy ending. So in the end of the story that is in Esquire magazine and that we would read in a short story collection like I read, Terry and Sling are in a fight. One has a knife and one has a razor blade, and they do cause some bodily harm to each other, but there is no death. They both walk away, not unscathed, but alive. Their women either ditch them or they tell them to, get away from them. They are their downfall. But they kind of like walk off into the sunset happily ever after. And that was what Esquire wanted from this story. But Langston Hughes did not want that to happen. And so in the end, they actually both die. And literally the last sentence of the original was, they were both dead. So we get a very different story. When I saw this, I had already read the story a few times, the edited version. And then I read this and I was like, oh my goodness, this changes so much about the story. But it also made me think, like, what was Langston Hughes's feelings on having to change the literal ending of the story? This changes what we can think about, because they survive in the edited version. So I was just trying to think of, like, if anyone is an author who is listening or watching, I'm just curious, how would you feel if a publication was like, I want to publish your story, but only if you change it in a fundamental way that changes the shape of the story? So if anyone has their opinion on that, I would love to know.
Yeah, Joey, I love that you called out earlier the authors that we love are often poets. We often talk about the way in which a person sees the world influences the art that they create. And I think Langston Hughes was doing a great job in both of these versions to say there is a hierarchy in Black culture. You can get on a freight train. These guys are hopping the rails. They're moving from town to town because they do not have a permanent residence. They are looking for work. They're trying to stick together. For me, if this was a film, it's a buddy picture. These guys meet and they have this initial banter back and forth. And it's like, you know what? We should stop trying to be tough guys together and we should just like hang out. We're going to be friends to the end. Don't get involved with women because they'll just ruin our friendship. They only can bring trouble. And Terry's like, I'm not going to do it. And Sling's like, I'm not going to do it. They land in Reno, where the majority of this story takes place, and they get jobs. They decide to see who's out there available in the dating pool. And they both come up with two very different women who are in very different social hierarchy situations. They look differently. They act differently. They have different ideas about themselves. And something I thought was interesting about the story, when you introduced this, you said, we don't know what Sling's real name is. We think Terry's called Terry, but we don't know what Sling's name is. The two female characters he puts in, one only will be referred to as Miss Angelina Walls. She's got all the names. You do not call me anything else. You use all of my title. And the other one is called Charlie May. And they're like, do you have a last name? And it's like, too, I'm not going to tell you. She just seems this very loose person who was not tethered to these status symbols. And the reason these guys, Sling and Terry, get into a fight at all is that the very, what would you call her, snooty girlfriend?
Yeah, she's sort of stuck up.
She's like, I'm educated and I don't even want to be in this bar because look around, this is a lot of riffraff. And I believe it was Sling who said, well, you know, this is the only bar that we as African Americans are allowed to be in. So you can either be here or go home. These are your choices, right? So I think Langston Hughes did a lot of this social commentary of you don't always get to choose what you would want to do for yourself. You are limited by what society would allow you to do. So I thought that was interesting. So the two girls get into a scuffle because the high class one, or the one who thinks she's high class, makes a very derogatory statement to the other one. They get into an argument. The women are like, guys, do something, which of course is, stereotypical behavior. The guys get into a tussle. One had a switchblade, as you said. The other had a straight razor. And they had both been really drinking. Prior to this, they're bosom buddies. They live together. They've traveled across the country. They said, we are going to stick together. We're never going to let women get between us. This is ridiculous. We've got a good thing going. And that scene unfurls. The reason that I prefer the Langston Hughes original is that these beautiful men, they're in their suits, they have new clothes on credit. They couldn't afford it, but they got all dolled up. They're out on the town. They're women who they were kind of just like getting to know, cause a problem, and they end up murdering each other. They both die. They both ruin their suit. Blood is shed, their friendship is shattered, and they're dead on the floor. And that just gutted me. And in both versions of the story, you see the crowd moving back, saying, give them some space. We want to see this fight play out. And the women started tussling a little bit, and they're like, no, ladies, you just have to wait your turn, because if there's two fights going on at one time, it ruins it. So that sort of blood sport, which took me immediately to Battle Royale by Ralph Ellison. That blood sport, people want to see other people in combat. And that just really, really disturbed me, Joey. So I'm going to stop there because there's so much and I'd love for you to respond to that. But how did you feel about the male friendship, and did that ring true to you as a guy?
Well, I certainly wouldn't be getting into any tussles over women. I could tell you that. So that part I'm left out of. But
yes, but the camaraderie of finding somebody that you can bond with in a very turbulent world, a very solid, steady relationship.
Yeah, well, I think that's part of why I really love this story, is from their friendship, Terry and Sling's friendship, and how connected they were and how they were sort of able to survive and thrive in Reno now because of each other. You know, they were able to rent an apartment together. They were able to support each other with clothing and borrow each other's clothing and stuff, which I think people would probably be like, oh, that's like a stereotypical thing that girls would do. And you're like, no, men can also do that. Okay, they were probably the same size. They were both described as tall, long boys or men. So we don't know. What does that even mean? Tall? Yeah, I guess. Like, they're tall and they're probably very thin. There is an illustration, which I'll put up right here, okay, from the Esquire magazine. I don't know who made it or if this was approved by Langston Hughes. I probably doubt it, that he would have the autonomy to be like, this is how I envision these characters. But you can see from that illustration that they are trying to have some upward mobility here. But anyway, okay, let me get back to what I was saying, because you're talking about obviously either ending where the Charlie May and Angelina caused this rift between them. When I originally read this, I thought like, oh, okay, women as sort of like original sin. I'm on board. But no, I think Langston Hughes is not doing this, because we can see from stories like Thank You, Ma'am, where he has a real reverence for women. I don't think that was the intention. I don't think it was to show that women are the root of evil in this story. But I do also want to acknowledge that women, and particularly Black women, had and do have a lot less agency and autonomy. So it makes sense that these women are insulted in a crowded bar in their community and don't have the ability to stand up for themselves in the same way that Terry and Sling do. And so they have to use them sort of as like avatars or whatever to say, I have been besmirched, and if I do not reclaim my honor, this will have devastating consequences for me as a woman. And so something has to be done. Whereas Terry and Sling, as men, they have more privilege in that they can sort of roll with the insult and it probably be fine in that context. So I don't think that he was trying to use them to ruin their lives. I don't think that was the point of it. But I think that there is a lot of performance that happens between Terry and Sling, where when they first meet, you mentioned this in the beginning, they're being very hyperbolic, where they're like, I'm tougher than you. And it's very immature sounding. So I assume that they're younger, number one, where it's like, oh, you think you're big and bad? Guess what I did? And he's like, you think that's big and bad? Guess what I did? Okay. And of course, they tell stories about how they slice the railroad bulls, who were like the police of railroads. I had to look it up, never heard of it. That's where Slice Him Down comes from, the title. I think with their hyperbolic stories about themselves, they're mythologizing themselves, their clothing and their adornment, and their motivation to be in a relationship with these women is for performance. So I think it's totally possible, because Langston Hughes was somewhere on that queer spectrum, okay? I don't think he came out and said it, so I don't know that anyone could definitively say where he landed on that, but I think it's totally possible that Terry and Sling were in some type of relationship, maybe not romantic one, but I think there was more there than just a platonic friendship.
Joey, I agree with you that it feels like an idealized friendship. This was friendship bordering on brotherhood, bordering on family. There was something very primal about the way that they took care of each other. Langston Hughes actually used the word telling tall tales. And he was like, we told tall tales from one part of the country to the other part of the country. So he's from the outside looking at these two characters and saying, how do they see themselves? How are other people seeing them? Is it because their situation is so dire? And one of the things that they said repeatedly through the story, anywhere, Lord, anywhere is better than here. So when they were jumping on the train to go to place, they didn't care where they ended up, because wherever they were going, it had to be better from where they started. And to me, that feels like a much bigger symbolic thing that was being put out by Langston Hughes, because as we know, during this time, very, very deep Jim Crow South, there was a lot of racism still in the North. It was just a really tough place to be an African American person. And Langston Hughes has Mrs. Angelina Wells say, you don't know how hard it is to be a Black woman. If I was white, I would have had an education. I'm doing the best I can with the opportunities that were afforded me. And I thought that was very insightful. And that is a little jab to white culture who would be reading this. We're doing this. We're a big part of why these things are happening. And that storytelling, oh, we're so tough. It felt like these guys were doing a little bit of role play to be these very tough macho guys. But he told Charlie May, the girlfriend, that they had sliced down these railroad bulls. So in the tussle with the woman, she's like, get up there and do what you told me you did that to the railroad bulls. Now get up there and prove to me you're a man. Like, take care of this, protect me. And I just thought that was such an interesting bit. When I originally looked up the story, Joey, a lot of people are like, oh, it's so funny. There's so much humor in this story. And I, in the first reading, failed to see the humor because for me, it was just so incredibly tragic. But the bit in this revised ending in Esquire that did literally make me laugh out loud, as they said it was really cold out and they hated winter and it was getting cold in Reno. So they had their brand new suits and their near silk, their almost silk shirts. They couldn't afford silk, but they had a near silk shirt on. And they had all of their clothes under them, all of these layers. So when he slices him, he was like, oh man, that just got my coat. And the other guy stuck the switchblade in his side near his kidney, the death shot. It's stuck in there. And everyone's like, oh my gosh, that's it. He's definitely going to die. And so they're like, stand back, stand back. I've got to unwrap him and see what the damage is. And they just keep like layer after layer. And it is this comical unraveling of the story. And he's like, not a scratch on me. But then we see that his friend now has a scar, like Omar from The Wire, down the side of his face. In the Esquire happy-go-lucky version, Terry's like, oh man, that's great. Look how tough I look now. Everyone will know I'm the man. I did it. Thanks, buddy, for slicing my face open in a bar fight, because now I'm like you. In fact, I'm better than you. You know why I'm better than you? Because your scar is hidden under your shirt, but mine is right on my face.
Yeah, I think the part of the humor is also that Terry and Sling both pass out after they're done fighting. And they're like, guys, wake up. You're not even dead. You're not dead. You just passed out. You have a little bit of blood on you, but like, you're fine. So get
Joey,
over it.
that's all in the revision.
Yeah, that's the Esquire. As we said, the original is that they kill each other. I forget now, how do they die? One stabs the other, and then
I think they both stabbed each other. One slit his throat and one stabbed him.
Sling stabs Terry in the belly still, but it goes through, and then Terry slices Sling's neck in the process of that. So they both KO each other basically, which is not
like
funny.
Mutual destruction, right? I'm stabbing you while you're stabbing me, and now nobody wins because we both literally fall down dead.
Yeah, less funny than the Esquire one. It, I guess, depends on what you would prefer to read. I think they're both great, but I think there's probably a little bit more humor in the Esquire one, which was, of course, on purpose, as we have discovered. But something that you've been touching on is, I think this story is really about classism, and we get that from the very beginning. I'll just read the opening here. Obviously, there is some antiquated language in here. Just keep that in mind. In Reno in the 1930s, among the colored folks of the town, there were two main social classes: those who came to the city on a freight train and those who did not. The latter, or cushion riders, were sometimes inclined to turn flat noses high at those who rode the rods by way of entry to the city. Supercilious glances on part of old settlers and chair cars arrivals tobogganed down broad noses at the black bums who, like the white bums, both male and female, streamed through Nevada during the Depression years on their way to or from the coast to remain a while if the law would let them in the biggest little city in the world, Reno, according to the official sign and electric lights near the station.
It just shows his poeticness. Instead of saying, I just look down my nose, it's like, my glance toboggan down the arch of my nose to look down at you. But who's looking down on who? Did it get us anywhere? It was just a very interesting thing about class. He often references skin color and skin tone. Even the gentlemen were making comments about the women that they had chosen. So I thought that was also really poignant and clear.
Yes, this is the first introduction to this story. Obviously, it's the opening lines. So we immediately have to understand that it solely depends in this context how you got to Nevada. Did you ride the freight train, which you're not supposed to, obviously, because that's why they have railroad bowls? Or did you take a passenger car, like, you're technically supposed to, if you could afford to do so? And those are how they're categorized. And so we have Terry and Sling, who both arrived in freight train. Although they are, of course, black, they are still men, and so they have a certain amount of privilege over women. So part of the tension is between, as you mentioned, Charlie May and Angelina, is because Charlie May arrived via freight train and Angelina came on a passenger train. And of course there is the colorism aspect, because Charlie May is said to be of a darker skin tone and Angelina is said to have lighter skin tone. And so there's obviously a lot of nuance within those things. So I think part of what they're also trying to do, Sling and Terry, they're trying to gain upward mobility. I mean, who wouldn't? Who doesn't? That's a natural thing in humanity. You do want to gain wealth or financial stability, access to safe housing, food and water, basic necessities. And have a little extra because you want to have fun. Obviously, everyone does. And so it's really interesting to me that Terry is dating Angelina. And as we have mentioned, she only is referred to as Mrs. and not Miss, MRS, Miss. Angelina Walls. So does this mean that Angelina is married somehow? Or she was previously married? But anyway, it doesn't really matter. I get maybe it's more of a respect thing. Like you're supposed to respect a woman that is married more than someone else that's not married.
Joey, I think it goes back to the hierarchy that often happens in domestic service. At least I know in the UK, this is how they do it. That she is the cook of a woman who came from San Francisco to Reno to get a divorce. And so maybe just as an honorific, the people in my household are all married. It's not a miss, it's Mrs., even if you've never been married. So that's how I took that, because it was also very curious, since she is so high and mighty, as my family would say, thinking so much of herself. Well, if you're actually married and you're on a date in a bar with a dude, probably not great for that time period.
Yeah, maybe that's not the best.
Yeah. And when you were talking about class, Joey, I understand the idea of classism, and that, different people are put in different classes. And for me, a huge indicator of that is economic security. And one of the things that was so interesting about that is that they're at the bar, and Terry and Sling both have jobs. They're making what they can make. They're pooling their resources. Charlie May had asked if Sling would move out and move in with her. So that was something that was lingering in the background that hadn't been spoken out loud, as far as we know, to Terry, but she was agitating, like, I need a man to take care of me. And you can ditch your friend now. You're with me. And we see how that worked out. But the reason I say that is that they're at the bar, and Angelina says to Terry, hey, I make more money than you, so why don't I buy a couple rounds so you can enjoy a drink on me? And I thought that was interesting. And then that fight breaks out. Are women allowed to have money? Do men feel shamed if women are providing for them? There was just all of this background nuance of what is the motivation behind these characters, because Angelina is like, my employer is going to lose their mind if I am here at the scene of a murder. So she just lit on out of the place. She's like, I gotta go. So Charlie May, who's, I think he said she was 3/4 cat, which I thought was very funny. She lands on her feet. She goes into the ladies' room, powders her nose, and comes back out. And by that time, the guys were like,
what are we doing now?
Hey guys, like, ready to go. Where's my drink? I'm ready. The guys were like, you know what? None of this would have happened without you, and the other one's gone, so you're out. And so it was just also this very interesting turn of events where one woman flees, one woman gets kicked out, and the guys are like, okay, back to the original pact. No women. It's just the two of us. Let's not get drunk and get in a bar fight and murder each other. Right?
Yeah. I mean, there's some excellent foreshadowing. That's also very interesting that I think about it, because he wrote an ending, a different ending. He didn't rewrite the whole story, because it does seem like foreshadowing in the beginning, when you had mentioned this earlier too, that they make a pact like, no more women. They mess us up. We fight about them, and it never works out for us. So let's not do that ever again. And so in the Esquire version, it does feel like foreshadowing, but in reality, it was not. I guess he did not know. He didn't intend for them to ditch these women or be ditched by them. So that's
and
super
Joey,
weird.
Just one little funny thing. I went to the actual 1936 May edition of Esquire magazine and looked at it. Mm-hmm. And who else was in there? Another man who really loves women and thinks they're amazing. Ernest Hemingway wrote an article in there, and then F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote a short story as well. So they were big literary guys, but as we have spoken about in the past, Ernest Hemingway is not always taking the side of women or treating them very well. So I think Esquire in general, as I understand it contemporarily, is a man's magazine. It's generally something that men would read. And so I think maybe drawing into, hey, men are awesome, and you know what's not awesome? Women, because they only want your money and they run out with the first sign of trouble, and you're probably going to end up in a worse situation if you stick around with them. So I just thought that was so curious. Again, who was this written for? What was he actually trying to say? What was his point? I think you hit it right on the nose, Joey, when you said he's talking about classism. He's talking about education. And Joey, there was that beautiful passage when they get ready to get off the train. And I think it was near Cheyenne. They did stop in Cheyenne at one point, and then they were moving on. He said it was nighttime, bad weather, and a lack of education that made it difficult for them to read the sign to say where they were. And so it was a little bit of humor there, but also the stark truth that these were not people who were privileged enough to get an education. And so there were a lot of things against them. So any town in their mind where they weren't going to get chased out of town was a good enough stopping point. Because when he wrote the line, no matter where we go on this train, there's no place we'll go where we're not black, just was twisting the knife in my heart to know that that was a reality for people at that time, that it didn't matter where they landed, their circumstances probably weren't going to be significantly better as far as being respected for their humanity in the society that they were living in. And it was like, oh, I'm so glad we've made such a progress in the right direction and people don't have to feel like that anymore, hopefully.
Yeah, the United States is still experiencing Jim Crow at this point, like you said earlier too. So there is that extra layer of segregation and lack of access, obviously, that comes with segregation, to certain public spaces like a bar, which is what they talk about. Like, I can't be caught here. And you're like, well, it's this or nothing. So I guess it's this, and sort of having that space. I wish sometimes we could talk to the author. Obviously, we can't talk to Langston Hughes and find out what the authorial intent really was. Like, was this meant to be about classism? I mean, it's pretty evident. He literally introduces the story, like you said, to that. But why make the change? Why is that the happy ending for Esquire? Is for them to survive? But wouldn't the true happy ending be that they reconcile their differences all together with the women as well, and then they go off and they get married and they have babies or whatever Langston Hughes may have thought was the happy ever after? But he does not do that. He subverts that expectation of what we would expect, sort of like a fairy tale happily ever after, what would that would look like. So again, they could be into each other. I like this story a lot better if that's what they're doing.
I appreciate your perspective, Joey. I did not share that perspective. I do think that they had a extremely close bond. I did not take that in a sexual way, especially at that time. That was not something that would even be winked or nodded at in any type of written correspondence, right? That's something you just can't
Well, do you know,
express.
actually, by 1930s, well, I don't know when this came about exactly, but because of Wizard of Oz, a term for gay men to identify each other was a friend of Dorothy from the Wizard of Oz. So they
I
could have
have
been that.
definitely heard that. The reason I say that is I read an article, which I will share with you, which was about a very scholarly African American man who went to Europe right before World War II. So it was several years after this particular incident happened. Very highly educated, PhD from Harvard, top of his class, the only black man in his entire graduating class, right? So he was very exceptional. He goes, he falls in love with a man, and he's exchanging letters with a very famous person that he was interested in. And the person wrote back, I'm disgusted by this. Like, I think you have me all wrong. And so this gentleman wrote a note and said, could you please do me the favor and destroy all evidence of this unfortunate misunderstanding? Because he knew that if that ever became public, because you write it down, it's there forever, that would really end his career. So I'm just very curious about, in general, what men were going through at that time who were homosexual and were not able to embrace that part of their life for fear of retribution from the outside community. And yeah, it's just something that's been on my mind a lot lately. When are people allowed to be exactly who they are and be authentic to themselves if they're not harming anyone else in the process?
Well, I guess we'll have to tell you when that happens because it hasn't happened yet.
Joey, we have really come a long way, I think.
Yeah. Well, we still got ways to go here. But it's totally possible that Sling and Terry are, they're roommates. Okay. I've heard that before,
Me too. And I totally fell for it. And then I was like, oh,
You
that's
mean.
different.
Yeah. So, I mean, that could also be causing tension in the story. But one thing that I wanted to mention about their scuffle was that they are clearly against fighting. And they feel obligated to do so because Langston Hughes writes about how they were scared to do this. They did not want to fight each other, especially with weapons. Not to say that you can't fight your friend. You would be like, yeah, you're just my friend, so I'll fight you kind of thing. You have to be like a lover to not want to fight someone. But I think it underlines their relationship to each other, whether it's platonic or romantic, it doesn't matter. Just their bond in general was so important to them that they were like, I'm backed up against the wall. I'm in public. I, of course, have to do this. I'm sure that they understood I have to stick up for my lady friend here. I had to do that. That is what is necessary now. And I don't have a choice. Like, that's it. Yeah.
Everyone expects it. The women expected it. The bar patrons expected it. So, Joey, Langston Hughes calls out twice in this story that there were opportunities for people to speak up and say, no, boys, don't fight. It's not worth it. You guys are friends. It's only over women. Just walk away. No one does that. And the only time someone intercedes is after it's all over and they've both given the final blow. And then the barman's like, okay, boys, okay, no need to fight. Break it up. We don't want any trouble here. And I just thought that was also very interesting that Langston Hughes put the complicity of the spectators and the bar owner and everyone who was watching that. Not one person said, take it outside. Nobody said, walk it off. And nobody said, hey, you guys are best friends. Seriously, everybody's been drinking. Let's just walk away and call it a night. So I found that very, very interesting, Joey.
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of hard because we're talking about two different endings. We should have just picked the original, I guess. But I think if I only read it as the original intent, that if I go in believing that these men are in some type of relationship with each other, that's not just friendship. How tragic is that story that they have to perform this feat of masculinity and virility, and it ends up killing both of them in the end. And something that they probably, had it been a different time, you know, in the year of our Lord 2026, probably wouldn't have had to have happened. Okay. They would have been able to ride off into the sunset together as a couple. In my imagination, this is how this story is actually intended, and no one can tell you different because Langston Hughes didn't tell us exactly. If someone knows where he did intend, I would love to read that. But I'm gonna use my imagination and my interpretation. But that is so heartbreaking to be like, you had to perform in all of these ways to mask yourself within society, and you ended up killing each other, and that's so sad.
It is very sad, Joey. And for me, the idea of performative violence, what else is that? But they were also performing to be, as you said, upwardly mobile. They bought their suits on credit. They got nice shirts to go under them. They got the gold chain, and they said it was a keychain. And like, we don't have any keys. And it's like, you don't need keys. It's all about the chains. And I thought, interesting that was the accessory Langston Hughes put in there. They didn't get a pocket watch. They didn't get some fancy jewelry or anything. It was a chain. That doesn't feel coincidental to me. It was just very, very curious. And I think we were also referencing the very clear relationship between Terry and Sling. Sling had a physical mark on him. He was obviously in a fight or had somehow received this marking on his body. And they were talking like, oh, Terry, you think you're so tough. And they called him like Terry the Terrier. So I also thought that fun, poetic Langston Hughes poetry was just coming through in that description. You don't have a mark on you. How can you be so tough if you don't have any marks? And so that idea of being initiated into this male culture by being scarred, by being the recipient of this violent aggression at the hands of his best friend, and then, as my mother would say, they kiss and made up. They just kind of said, oh, yeah, that was a weird night. Okay, well, let's just get on with our life. I just thought that was just really super curious, Joey. And I like your version of the only way that they could be together is
Death.
To do that. To death. Well, they are together now. Dead.
So death do us part.
I don't like it, Joey.
Yeah. And I think there's sort of a nod to other literary works in this story is the emphasis on their lack of overcoat, because overcoats, of course, were more expensive, and they were something that you probably didn't need all year long in the areas that they were living. Nowhere really in the United States do you need a winter, an overcoat all year, even in the northern areas. Of course, we have one of the most famous examples of the titular overcoat by Nikolai Gogol, which is a fantastic story that we have also read on this channel/podcast. So check that one out. Shameless plug.
I knew that was coming.
Yeah, that comes up in In Russian literature in particular, it comes up a lot. But in other works, it comes up where this overcoat is a status symbol. If you can afford this extra layer that protects you from the elements and that protects your clothing that you would switch out on a more routine basis, you've made it. You have financial stability, you have access to wealth. It is something that garners respect because people obviously understand that nuance of like, this isn't sort of an unnecessary part, because they do layer their older clothes underneath their newer suits. And in the Esquire version, it saves his life. I just think that it's fun when you can see these little things and recognize them in other pieces of literature from around the world in different times. Dostoevsky and Gogol are writing in a completely different part of the planet in a completely different time and era and a very different lived experience. But I think that's what's fun about expanding your literary horizons, is that you're like, oh, wait a minute, even maybe he didn't even intend. I doubt that Langston Hughes didn't know that from literature. I'm sure he was extremely well read. He was obviously super smart. So, but even if he didn't, he still is engaging with literary tradition, and that's fun.
Yeah, and those little nods, as you said, the more you experience literature, the more you see these through lines kind of running through. And for me, it has deepened my experience of reading because I'm like, I wonder what that was about. One of my favorite parts, in addition to the tobogganing down your nose, casting glances down your nose from your high position, I really love that they said one of the last layers of clothing he took off sling was a gray sweatshirt. That was his bottom layer, but it was the pulling off of his clothes in public, of unmasking him, just layer after layer. And as you said, it's like, I got my nice stuff on up front and all my bling. And then you see my ratty old gray sweatshirt from way, way back was the thing that they saw next to his skin. And it was just kind of that interesting thing of like really truly being exposed, and that your artifice and your idea about yourself is just getting stripped away. And I just thought that was just very interesting. And who has showy things? Because the thing that I remember about Charlie May, and it felt like in that story that she was perhaps a sex worker, a person who was not in a stable financial situation. She had a gold watch and a rabbit fur coat, and she was pretty fancy. And what I thought was curious about the way Langston Hughes decided to describe her, it said that she was half African American, but also looked like an Indian, as in a Native American person. And I also thought that was interesting if we talk about skin color. Is a light-colored person different than a dark-colored person? And just all of those things that we've talked about over time sort of interlaced in just the descriptors of who these people were.
Yeah, there is a lot to this story, even though it's very short. I mean, that's how it is with all the short stories that we read. We're like, wow, there's just so many details that we could analyze, and obviously we can't choose to talk about every single thing because this would take a very long time to discuss all those things. But I think we talked about all the like overall things. Like if you wanted to read the story and you thought like, okay, this is a good story, obviously. But what was it about? I think we gave you some good information to walk away with to help you gain a deeper understanding for this story. Hopefully it inspires you to read more of Langston Hughes and to read Thank You, Ma'am in particular. That's another amazing story by him. Of course, like I said in the beginning, he has so many other works to get through, but you could read those and then you can listen to our podcast or watch our YouTube channel. See what we have to say about it.
Absolutely, Joey. And I think you often remind us, hey, if you want to know what the story's about, read the story. It is very short. It is readily available in the form in which it was published in Esquire magazine. So you will get the enhanced, happier ending. You can make up your own mind about that. But if you do a quick Google search, you can also probably come up, as you did, Joey, with the original manuscript that showed a very, very different story being told in the end. Next week, we are going to tackle some poetry. So I'm really excited about that.
So, yeah, but contemporary poetry this time.
All right, Joey. Well, I look forward to seeing you then.
Okay, bye.
Bye.